Hello, hello. Dr. Kirk here to talk to you more about American musical identity. hmm Today we're talking about Leonard Bernstein and the Cosmopolitan American identity. Um, now let's see what we have going this week. All right, so the big questions that we're talking about this time are what kind of American musical identity does Leonard Bernstein represent, as opposed to what we discussed with Copeland and with Gershwin? And we're going to talk about why that matters to our overall discussion this semester. So, Bernstein was more of a mid 20th century American composer. He was born in 1918. So, you can do the math on that. He was 18 years younger than Copeland and 20 years younger than Gershwin. And he kind of picked up where those composers had already laid the groundwork in terms of exploring the musical identity of our country. And he is especially known for a composer who blurs boundaries. And these are lots of different boundaries that we'll talk about, especially in terms of music. Okay, cosmopolitanism. We have discussed this term before. This has to do with a pluralistic cultural identity. We've used that word a lot as well. So many, many different things that are pulled together to make an entirely different sound. So this embraces multiple traditions, rejects narrow nationalism. So keeping in mind, nationalism is just the idea of expressing something of your nation or your cultural identity. But the narrow view of it might be one that only one specific thing can reflect what your country stands for or sounds like or whatnot. And as we know, it's a very big country. We have lots and lots of different people with different ideas, different kinds of music, different kinds of everything. And so there's not just one thing that can reflect what our country is all about. So Bernstein is all about this cosmopolitanism, all of these things, embracing many different traditions, being inclusive and pluralistic, and all of these things, bringing together many different things is what he's all about. So we're going to see how that affects his music. So he was known as many, many different things. He was a composer, composed all kinds of diverse music, we'll explain here shortly, and was a conductor. He was a conductor of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, which we will also talk about more in short. There's a very famous little story, you'll have to read it if you haven't already, about Bernstein. So he was the assistant conductor to the New York Phil, and the conductor, who was a European-born conductor. All of them were, all of the major orchestras here in our country all had European conductors at that point. And on one specific day, that conductor got very ill and was not able to perform. So they called Bernstein, and he, in a very short amount of time, maybe a couple hours notice or something, was able to get there, rehearse, and perform, conduct the orchestra. And that put him on, national headline news, that he was so young, he was just in his 20s, and B, was the first American born conductor to do this. So this was a big deal. And in his role as the New York Phil conductor, was able to have a huge influence on American music. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. He was also an educator, both in his role with the New York Phil and in other respects. We'll talk about that. And he was a big celebrity. He was not the same kind of celebrity as Gershwin, but he was very famous for a lot of reasons. And we'll talk about how that influenced not just American music, but the culture in general. He was also known as a public intellectual. I mentioned to you as I brought all that stack of Copeland books when we were talking about Copeland just a few weeks back. And one of the books that I showed you was Music and Imagination. That was Copeland's set of lectures, 6 lectures that he gave at Harvard as a guest lecturer. and he published those all, compiled them all into one book. Bernstein also gave a set of lectures at Harvard, was a guest conductor, or sorry, lecturer, just like we said about Copeland. But he televised, he videotaped it, and it made a whole, it was a bit more of a spectacle, I suppose. Also was compiled and published in a volume, and he titled it The Unanswered Question. And this is this title borrowed from Ives' composition called The Unanswered Question. And this was intentional, that he was trying to make parallels between linguistics and music, and how words and sounds and letters and sentences and phrases and all of the things have parallels in terms of music. And he gets very, very intellectual about it, and maybe even more so than he needed to, as he was really wanting to be viewed as an intellectual. So number 6 here, this is already alluded to, but he was one of the few American musicians that occupied all of these roles, which is part of why we're talking about him. He wasn't just a composer, but it's many different things. So let's talk about the Young People's Concerts. This was a series that Bernstein initiated as the conductor of the New York Philharmonic. He televised concerts on Saturday mornings. Oh, I have some funny formatting here on my slides. Sorry about that. He televised all of these on Saturday mornings, keeping in mind that at that time, 50s, 60s, 70s, there were not thousands of TV channels that you can stream anytime you want. There were only a handful of stations that you could choose from. So pretty much the whole nation was watching this. And what he did was he not only played concerts, but he taught different aspects of music. And so this reached millions of Americans. He treated the audience as intellectuals in their own right, even though they were children for the most part, children of all different ages. But he explained lots of musical topics, some of which were more complex, like what is the meaning of music? What is American music? This is one that I suggested to you that you watch. This would be beneficial. What is orchestration? What makes music symphonic? What is a concerto? All kinds of things. What is impressionism? And they're all available for you now on YouTube. So it makes it really easy to access and just see how he taught these things, see what he was teaching, and you'll get a good idea of what he was all about. So his viewpoint here was to provide education without dumbing it down. So even though he was gearing this towards children or just, young people in general, he was trying to make serious topics very accessible. He also wanted that education to be entertainment. It should be interesting and entertaining and fun for the students, for the children, and for the adults who brought them, and that musical ideas can connect to human experience. We all know this to be true. Democratic ideals and media. We mentioned this about Gershwin, and we'll talk about this with Bernstein as well, that media was a big part of their career. This was not true with Copeland. And that's not true that he never appeared on any kind of media. We'll see him actually in some of Bernstein's young people concerts and whatnot that were televised, and other video recordings and things like that. But Copeland was not interested in TV at all, not watching it, not being on it, not interested in radio. And so where we see Gershwin's career, that really skyrocketed from being participating in that newest technology, which was radio at that time. And we see this also with Bernstein here, and television. That was a big deal, that he was in everybody's home all across the nation, he became a household name at a very young age. On his podium, really, literally and figuratively, be able to to introduce millions and millions of people to all kinds of music. So that was a big deal to him. The television as a democratic medium, that was a way of that everyone can participate in this. He broke down barriers of class, geography, and education. And this goes right along with the idea of being able to see it in your own home. It's not only the wealthiest people that can go buy a ticket to the concert hall, which, is still true today. I actually was just recently looking at tickets for a concert with the LA Phil, and the tickets have skyrocketed. They're just, even the cheapest seats were well over $100 a piece. And that just didn't used to be the case. It used to be that regular people could go. It cost money, of course, but it wasn't like so much money. So the idea that music doesn't have to be highbrow, it doesn't have to be only intellectuals that can appreciate it, or only wealthy people that can appreciate it, or people with a certain level of education, but anyone can access and appreciate this music. So cultural participation is Bernstein saw as a democratic right. Everyone should be allowed to participate in that, not only those of means and whatnot. So that's what we just described here. So Bernstein was known as a cultural leader. As I mentioned to you, his role as the music director in the New York Philharmonic was an enormous platform for him to conduct and to speak authoritatively as a prominent conductor. He was the first American-born conductor in that role, as I mentioned to you. And as part of that, he championed other American composers. So I mentioned to you that he brought Copland on the young people's concerts and other televised concerts that he had, and other American composers that he brought, so that they would also be known to those audiences that he's reaching millions of people. He had some adventurous and eclectic programming. He would introduce some very new, modern, avant-garde types of pieces that were not always the types of pieces that those regular audiences were used to viewing, such as, the regular Beethoven, Bach, Brahms, these types of things that are real staples in the concert halls, still are today. But he was great at bringing new things to those audiences and helping to acquaint them with some of that newest American music that was available. He was an artist, of course, and an activist. We talked a little bit about this. He was known as a public figure in terms of civil rights advocacy, and he opposed the Vietnam War. He had vocal political opinions. And you can, let me know your opinion about this, if that was a pro or a con. I was thinking about the last election cycle, which was, of course, very contentious. And I saw a lot of celebrities come out and voice their opinions about one or another candidate. And to me, I don't look to celebrities, whether actors or musicians or other types of celebrities, for my political opinions. Those are not the people that I trust to give me, unbiased political opinions. But that's what Bernstein, that's part of what he was about. He used his platform as a celebrity, as a public figure, to voice those opinions. And for some, that was appreciated, and for others it wasn't. Obviously, if you don't appreciate or agree with those opinions, then that would be a bit more controversial. So this raises questions about art and politics. Like, should those two things go together? Do they have any business going together? You can let me know your opinion on that. And that as a celebrity, does that make him an authority on anything else in our culture, whether politics or social issues or anything else? That should those two things go together is a question that you can answer. Okay, criticism and controversy. There was some controversy with Bernstein, as there are with most composers. In some respects, some people saw him as too theatrical or self-promoting. I mentioned to you his Harvard lectures where he had to make sure they were all televised and invited all the public in, and so they could all see him being very intellectual. Whereas Copeland gave was invited to give the same set of lectures that he did none of those things. It's just a really different approach to it. So in some ways, he was a bit self-promoting. Some criticized him for oversimplifying complex ideas, which is a little bit ironic because one of the things that was such a big deal with him we talked about that with the young people's concerts especially, was that he did provide these complex ideas in a more accessible way to younger people or people who aren't music scholars, but that they can understand it. And then we talked about his political views. Some were seen as controversial. So that tension reflects a broader cultural conflict, which he lived a long lifetime as did Copeland and many other composers, where there were many different things taking place in our culture during his lifetime, and quite a few conflicts revolved around that as well. All right, let's talk a little bit about his stylistic range because it is very broad, very broad. So he composed symphonies. Um, his symphonies are very, very serious works. So if you haven't listened to any of those, it might be worth just a quick listening so that you have an idea what I'm talking about here. I did not put those on your listening list for the week because they're just entirely different. His musical theater works, however, like West Side Story, of course, most famous, and Fancy Free and On the Town are just um, entirely different. They're much more audience appealing. They're some boisterous and upbeat, and West Side Story is not entirely, but there are aspects of it that's just entirely separate. His sacred works are very, very eclectic. We'll get to that just shortly. His film scores, some great, lush orchestration, best known for On the Waterfront, which if you haven't watched that movie, I believe it was 1954 or something. That's if you're familiar with Marlon Brando has the line, "I could have been a contender." That's from that movie. I don't love the movie to be honest, but the film score is fantastic. The music is great, so it's totally worth listening anyway. And his chamber music as well. All of these are vastly different. It's just a lot of variety and eclecticism in his stylistic range. And I said here it's unified by synthesis and hybridity. So I guess that is a good wording to say that he's very, very eclectic and brought in lots and lots of different styles, but does a good job of blending those together. Um, Hi. Oh, that's okay. I'm just recording something. Okay, so let's talk about aesthetic pluralism. So, Bernstein did it. Sorry, slight distraction. Um, Pluralism, we've talked about a bit in this class of multiple different things being um, layered over the top of each other or brought together. One way that we see this with Bernstein is that he cuts down these boundaries of genre boundaries that he considers to be artificial. What is the difference between popular music and serious music or concert music and popular music? What's the difference? Well, we've pretty much made up those differences on our own, culturally speaking. We've sort of made those divisions. And we talked about this a bit with Gershwin too, the difference between jazz and concert music, or the difference between jazz then and jazz now, or many, many, many different types of what we would now call jazz. Those divisions are somewhat arbitrary that we've just made those yes, we've just made them up. So no musical style is inherently superior to another. We typically find people think that classical music is very sophisticated and highbrow, intellectual and whatnot. And still, you'll find on TV shows or on movies, if they're showing a character or a group that are supposed to be either really wealthy or intellectuals or sophisticated or high culture, this type of thing, then they're playing classical music in the background almost every time. And we still find that today. But Bernstein was saying, that doesn't have to be the case, that only one kind of music can be better than every other kind of music. That's not necessarily true. And so he tries to elevate many different genres of music. And in that, he finds that diversity, that those different aspects is a strength. We can bring those things together. And they don't have to be all divided. So in this, he considers pluralism as an American value. And again, you can let me know your opinion on this. Do we consider this a value? As like that is our American value, is that we have so many different things that come together. Okay, let's talk about West Side Story. So West Side Story's got to be his most famous musical theater work, bar none. In this, he uses jazz-influenced rhythms, different than Gershwin did, but still, and Latin American dance forms, trying to reflect the Puerto Rican culture of this immigrant group that was, half of the factions. If you're not familiar with this story, we have Puerto Rican immigrants, and then we have native-born New Yorkers that are at odds with each other. And so trying to reflect the Puerto Rican culture, then he brings in some Latin American sounds to try to reflect that in the music. We also find some classical techniques. There's counterpoint, and there's polyphony, and there's all kinds of things. When I said number 6, the simultaneous singing of quartets and whatnot, we find all kinds of interweaving of lines and things that you don't necessarily see in every Broadway song form, but he has some of those too. So there's some really great songs from West Side Story. If you're not familiar with all of them, it's worth a listen. And this is still quite often performed today. Just in this last year, LA Opera performed another production of West Side Story. And as I said, it's still quite often performed these days, even after all of these decades. It is in many ways accessible, that it seems like mostly regular people, and they have a sympathetic story. It's basically a Romeo and Juliet type of story, if you're not familiar. And and there's a love story, and the star-crossed lovers, and this kind of thing is sympathetic to regular audiences, but it's also sophisticated in his approach to the music, that he uses all of these sort of classical techniques, even in a more popular song style. So his symphonies, as I mentioned to you, are very different. Jeremiah, The Age of Anxiety, and Kaddish are very, very serious, angst-filled, harsh, and much harder to listen to, in my opinion, than his theater works. He he was born into a Jewish family, and his father was very devout. And Bernstein, at least into his adult years, really struggled with whether he believed what his father believed, and how that, so there was an inner conflict there, whether he believed that or not, and how that affected his relationship with his father. And a lot of that inner turmoil is reflected in these symphonies. That it's these philosophical and spiritual concerns. These are all things where he has just an inner tension and angst. It's just a very, very different approach to composing than in his theater works. His sacred works, also very different. His Mass is the best known of these sacred works, 1971. So this is much later than West Side Story and many of the other popular sounding things. This is very, very eclectic. So I mentioned this here, liturgy and rock and blues and avant-garde. So imagine uh, um, mashing together of all of these different influences, genres, styles, etc. It's quite unusual, quite eclectic. It explores faith, doubt, authority, and justice. Again, it's quite an unusual smattering of things, and it is highly controversial. And you can imagine even just the things I've told you about it, if you've never heard it before, that already it's unusual. So he was born Jewish. He was not Catholic. He was writing a Catholic mass, but it's not really Catholic. And it has a very eclectic smattering of different influences and things. Very unusual. So on the bottom part of our slide here, you see this eclecticism. Is this a strength or a weakness? Artistic synthesis or stylistic inconsistency, right? There is a way to bring in many different influences and combine them together and synthesize them into one that sounds like a reasonable whole, one whole. It all fits together, rather than things that are kind of just smashed in there together and they don't seem to fit. So that's a question that you can answer. Is eclecticism a strength or a weakness? There are composers who are going to do it really well and some that won't. We talked about this all the way back with Dvorak, telling the American composers to plug in folk tunes. And at that time, that was not a good synthesis of those folk tunes, that they would often take them and put them on top of what otherwise sounded like a European symphony. And then it didn't seem to fit. But Copland did a great job of synthesizing those folk tunes and really marrying them together with his orchestration to make it all sound like it fits together. Like it's inevitable that those folk tunes would grow out of his work. And you'll have to listen a little bit to the mass and then tell me what you think, if Bernstein has really fit them together in a synthesized way, one way that's inevitable that they fit together, or if it really isn't, that it feels like all of these different pieces don't really fit. And this brings back the question of accessibility versus seriousness, as we find with many of his works, that he's trying to blend those things. And I'm not sure whether he did that here in the Mass effectively. You can tell me what you think. Okay, just a few more things here. Competing visions of American music. So we've talked about the idea of broad appeal and accessibility. That was part of Copland's career, right? His Appalachian Spring, Billy the Kid, Rodeo, all of these were very accessible things, which many people loved and some criticized, versus intellectual rigor and avant-garde innovation. Bernstein really did both of these things. He would say that he was firmly in the first camp. He wanted broad appeal and accessibility. And that was true in his theater works and his young people's concerts. His whole goal was to make it accessible. However, other things like his symphonies and the Mass and others, really, his Norton lectures at Harvard, really affect the intellectual rigor and the avant-garde. That's much more what that's about. So although his goal was to be in that first camp, that was not necessarily his entire career. So his legacy, as we mentioned, his conducting was world famous. He conducted all over the world, and he was especially known for his highly expressive conducting style. Those of you that are conductors, especially, you should look on YouTube. There is a video of him conducting the orchestra without his hands. He puts his hands in his pockets and he only uses facial expressions, raising an eyebrow or this kind of thing. And that's all he does. It's really clever. And they follow him. They do a great job. Bernstein was also a great Mahler enthusiast. He conducted all of the Mahler symphonies many, many times. And you can hear some different interpretations when you listen to different recordings from early in his career through late in his career, how he interprets those a little bit differently. And he expanded the role of American conductors. We said he was one of the first big American conductors in this kind of role of a world famous symphony, and also recorded a lot of works in that role, which was also new, and also taught from the podium, taught audiences, and that was also new. So all of these were very influential. He was an educator, as I mentioned to you. He had a lasting impact on his young people's concerts and still does. We can watch them all on YouTube. This became a model for music education in many ways, trying to explain complex topics to young people. And his communication as an artistic responsibility, that is being able to communicate what a composer should do, what music should do, how this should affect us, all these things he considered a responsibility. So, like Copeland, he educated in a way that was not in a regular faculty position at a university or a school, but as an educator as a whole. So in his young people's concerts is a big way, of course, we're talking about it, but he also gave guest lectures in places and wrote articles and things like this. So there are other ways that he was reaching audiences than in a regular, 9 to 5 kind of job. And also was a composer, of course. We talked about this. West Side Story remains hugely famous and also one of the most performed theater works. Certainly by that type of composer. His concert works are increasingly reassessed. They are still often performed. Not his symphonies, not as often as his theater works. So West Side Story, which was turned into a set, he arranged it for a set of symphonic dances. Those are performed quite often, as well as some of his others. And his accessibility is no longer seen as a flaw, at least by, there were some that critiqued him for it. I think in our culture now, accessibility is more acceptable than it would have been when Copeland and then Bernstein were addressing this with audiences. Okay, so just a couple of closing questions for you. Is Bernstein's eclecticism a strength or a weakness? Given what you've read and listened to, and now we've discussed, you can let me know your opinions on that. Should American music prioritize accessibility or complexity? Which do you think is more indicative of our culture? How that has changed over many different time periods in our country. And what responsibilities do you see artists having in public life? Do you feel like they should simply do their art and stay over there in their lane and not express views in politics or other social issues? Or do you feel like they should use that celebrity or fame to be able to express their opinions in other aspects of life? And those are things that I would love to hear your opinions on. Next time, we'll be talking about what composers or musicians you see that should be part of the American music canon. Like, who else has really, really influenced our culture besides these big three that I've mostly discussed so far this semester? So I love to hear your opinions. I look forward to seeing you next week.